This week on The Final Straw, we're sharing an interview that we conducted with anarchists and abolitionists, mostly in and around Manila, the capital of the Philippines. During the chat, they share about their projects, discussions of abolitionism in the Philippines, decolonization discourse, informal organizing, accountability, and challenging patriarchal dynamics in the traditional left, as well as other topics. Check out our show notes at our website, or in your podcatcher, or in whatever streaming app you're listening to this on, for links to some of the projects represented, projects that guests suggest, and soon a transcription of this interview. After the interview, we'll feature a quick update by Kevin Rashid Johnson about his medical condition, being denied treatment for prostate cancer at Nottoway Correctional in Virginia. But first, a quick announcement. There is currently a fundraiser going for the mutual aid space Knoxville, or MASC, which was flooded during recent storms. This space houses supplies for Eastern Tennessee Harm Reduction, the Knoxville Radical Library, and Knoxville First Aid Collective. You can find a link to donate to on their GoFundMe by searching for Help Mutual Aid Space Recover from Flood, or by checking our show notes. But first, some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a bomb!
This is the tale of two shootings. A week ago, we had the Greenwood Park Mall shooting in Indiana. Days later, officials released the most exhaustive report on the Robb Elementary shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Two mass shootings, totally unrelated. But comparing and contrasting what we know of these two shootings can be very revealing. Let's begin with the Robb Elementary shooting. The official report released this past week is 77 pages. And while we can always expect government reports to justify and mitigate and gloss over government failures, what this report admits is quite damning. The shooter at Robb Elementary was not an experienced one. He had never previously fired a weapon. He arrived and entered the school and went to his old classroom, room 111. The lock on the classroom door was broken. Police responded quickly. Police body cam captures one officer complaining that they needed to get in there, but the shooter wouldn't stop shooting. A total of 77 minutes passed before police breached the classroom and took down the shooter. There were, by the end, 376 officers present from local, state, and federal agencies. The report admits that it is possible that some of the victims who died may have not bled out if police had gone in sooner. 376 cops, 77 minutes, 21 dead, including 19 children. One of the responding cops was married to one of the teachers. She was texting him from inside the classroom. He didn't go in. I have to wonder his response to his wife's texts. Sorry, honey, not coming in. I told you teaching was too dangerous. It would have been true if he said that. Teachers have far more dangerous jobs than police. In fact, police have one of the safest jobs there is. In Uvalde, that cop whose wife was in the classroom is still alive. His wife is not. She died waiting on someone to come in and save her. No one did. 376 cops, including her own husband, waited 77 minutes. With 376 cops concentrated in one place for so long, that was probably the safest day in history to be an unarmed black man in Texas. Unarmed black men across the state could sell single cigarettes out of the pack, walk out of a convenience store without paying for a handful of cigars, buy alcohol with a fake 20, swerve left of center, and drive with the taillight out, and not get shot and killed by cops, at least for 77 minutes. Which leads to a reasonable question. What are the odds that those 376 officers would have waited to go in if instead of a shooter, they were called to deal with an unarmed black man creating a disturbance? Hundreds of cops would have been injured trying to get through that doorway at once. And that unarmed black man would have been dead 76 minutes faster than the shooter who actually occupied the classroom that day. 376 cops, 77 minutes, 21 dead. Now, let's contrast that to the Greenwood Park Mall in Indiana. There, the shooter prepared in the bathroom and then targeted the food court. According to reports, the event lasted 2 minutes. The shooter killed 2 people and injured 2 others. He was then shot and killed by a guy named Elijah Dickens, a shopper who had come to the mall with his own pistol on him. By all available accounts, Dickens is just some guy. There's no indication that he had military training or police training or any other kind of training. He certainly didn't have the hours and hours of active shooter training logged by 376 cops in Uvalde. So in this instance, we have 2 minutes, 2 dead, and 0 cops. Now, I've got a question for you. If you had to choose, where would you rather be? At Robb Elementary, protected by 376 cops? Or at the Greenwood Park Mall, protected by none? If you answered the same way as any other rational, sane person, I have to ask you, why in the do we have cops? I'll ask it twice so Burrs can edit that word again. Why in the do we have cops? And don't try to tell me that Uvalde is just a one-off. It's not. There were armed agents there from multiple federal agencies, from state police, from the county, from several local police forces. It's not like this is just one batch of cowards who all got trained badly by the same instructor. These cops represented a multiplicity of agencies, training schools, approaches, and chains of command. They only had one thing in common. After all that training and all those hours of collecting pay sitting on their asses, they converged on this one moment of truth and cared more about their own welfare than they cared about innocent, unarmed kids staring up the barrel of a loaded automatic rifle. Flat out. They're representative of cops everywhere. Millions of salaries, health and dental packages, pensions, celebrated with that stupid blue stripe on flags on hooded sweatshirts, enjoying free coffee at gas stations and convenience stores. Why in the do we have cops? Fire every single one of them. Take back their standard issue. Give the guns to folks like Elijah Dickens. Save billions of dollars you can reinvest in education and mental health and a million other priorities. Don't defund police. Abolish them. This is a tale of 2 shootings. If you disagree with my conclusions and need more anecdotal evidence, don't worry. There'll be a couple hundred more mass shootings before the end of the year. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the super duper uber mega ultra hyper turbo multi maxi-max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're heading to the gun range because you can't count on the cops, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. Psst. You can Cash App $Swaniac 1969 or send dough to us and comment that it's for Swain's defense. More info is also available on Instagram at Swaniac 1969 or Twitter at SwainRocks.
Okay, I can start by introducing myself. I go by Kay. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm from the Philippines, and I'm part of Abolition. Yeah, Abolition.
I guess it's my turn next. I'm Adrienne. I use they, she pronouns. I'm also from Abolition, but I'm also with the dinner party, and I'll be speaking on behalf of everyone on dinner party for today, I guess.
I'll go next. Hi, my name is Honey. I'm also part of Abolition. I am Filipina, but I'm currently in occupied Hohokam and Akimao-Otham land, which is known to be modern day Phoenix, Arizona. But I'll be going back to the Philippines by next month. So, right.
I think I can go next. I go by Kaso and he, they pronouns. I'm part of Paglaya and also Project Kapwa, but I also converse with people in the dinner party and abolition.
Okay, so that leaves me. Hi, I'm Magsalin from Abolition as well. I'm a bit of a writer, aspiring at least. So, yeah.
Cool. It's very nice to meet you all. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you all for being here. You've mentioned at least a few: Abolition, the dinner party, Paglaya, Project Capua. Could you maybe talk a little bit about each of these projects in turn and the sort of work you do and how the projects came to be?
Okay, so Abolition was started out as a working group in 2020, I think. Bandilang and Tim held a educational discussion on what if there were no police in prisons, and from that developed like a core group of people to expound upon abolitionist organizing here in the Philippines. And from there, it's been growing a little. It's quite nice. I like the growth so far. And we've been, I feel like we've made some headway in actually getting abolitionist ideas, defund the police, transformative justice, these things out there. And I'm pretty happy with what we've done so far, but we could still, do more. Honey was actually one of the speakers in that event, so that's why I think I've always looked up to Honey as a
Thank you,
Forerunner.
Magsalin. But yeah, so we organize abolition coming from that online discussion that we had, and we do a lot of things in abolition. Like, we don't want to be confined in like very specific kinds of organizing, because that's something that we are trying to challenge within our groups. So we do survivor support, we do harm reduction, mutual aid, we do a lot on transformative justice and accountability. We are trying to do a lot more on prisoner support. But yeah, we're trying to work on that because it's hard to navigate it with our current political climate here in the Philippines. We are also trying to engage with other organizations and projects to engage them in abolitionist ideas and organizing. Anyone else who would like to add into that?
I guess just as an extension about abolition, the dinner party sort of came out a bit after abolition, and so the dinner party became, what do you call this? It's like the affinity group that grew around abolition and other adjacent and parallel projects with people who were similarly or sharing different spaces and getting to know each other in these related spaces together. And so we pulled everyone into just a random group chat, and you were like, hey, maybe we should have a name for ourselves. And then so we found one of these tweets that were targeting the affinity group we were in, and then they started saying we shouldn't be too, I don't know, I guess a bit too fluffy, I guess, with our politics. And they started saying things like the revolution is in the dinner party. But then we were like, but why shouldn't it be? Why can't it be? And so that's how we got our name. And so the dinner party isn't necessarily the collective that is, it's not an umbrella, I guess, for different collective efforts like Abolition and Paglaya and Project Kapwa, but it's this space where we all come together and gather and just talk and share ideas and find inspiration from each other's different projects and efforts, whether it's political or personal. So yeah.
This is kind of like pointing towards a question that I was going to ask later, but I'm curious about the genealogy of the term abolition in the Philippines. Like, it has a pretty specific historical context within the U.S., coming from the movement to abolish slavery and then developing through a critique of the 13th Amendment in the U.S. Bill of Rights that said that slavery was abolished except for when someone was convicted of a crime. And it's pretty
obvious that there's a racialized and class element to who gets convicted of crimes in the United States, at least. And I would imagine it's pretty pretty common among a lot of countries. But I kind of wonder what abolitionist discourse, how that trajectory developed in the Philippines and sort of how it looks different to your understandings from how it is in the U.S.
Basically, the name abolition took a page from the Black radical tradition. It's very clear that we borrow from the Black radical tradition itself, and we pay homage to it in a sense by the name itself. Other abolitionist groups probably give their names, like give some names that are friendlier, but we just thought that abolition was like it's declaring with an exclamation point, abolition now.
To add to that a bit, no? So while we're very conscious about the difference in context, because obviously in Philippine history, we also had a context of slavery. That's slavery, but the context is so different such that I think it's more really related to class than race or different ethno-linguistic groups or anything. So it's that consciousness as well that I think we also bear when we practice and when we talk about abolition, just because it's really a very Western, I would say, concept that we're working with, but we're also trying to adopt a lot of the ideas so that it really fits our context in the Philippines better.
Okay, thanks for that. And I personally find a lot of inspiration that philosophical and action-oriented heritage has found its way and expression in so many different contexts, and necessarily in each of these different contexts, whether it be the Philippines or it be abolitionist work in South Africa or in Chile or wherever people are like implementing that terminology, there's a lot of commonalities that even despite the different histories, you can say we have these generalized sources of, incarceration, we have these structures of policing. They may have a different history or slightly different scent to them, but they all kind of stink in the same way. So I think that's a really interesting point for me. Would anyone from Paglaya or like Castle or Project Capua want to speak a little bit about what those projects are or who's involved in it, like what your goals are? Unless somebody wants to react directly to what I just said.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to react directly to what you said. So it's interesting to note that Alex Vitale, for example, he noted that model that the American colonial government used in the Philippines was directly transplanted and used to suppress proletarians in Philadelphia. So it's very clear how that policing was brought to the Philippines as a colonial concept, instituted as a colonial concept, and then through the machinations of imperialism, this was transplanted and used against those in the core, the proletarianized in the core. So that's very interesting. Very important to note that little thing.
I think it's important to mention as well that there is other organizing spaces or like tendencies, specifically like the leftist movement, the National Democratic Movement, who do have a different meaning for abolition. Like they do want to abolish police and prisons, but they want to replace it with something else that represents, like their group. So they want to replace it with what they call the People's Court and People's Police. So yeah, that's kind of like different from what we do, because like we want to totally abolish, like carceral systems, and with them, like their meaning of abolition is just abolishing the current power structures that, that's there, the current carceral power structures, but replacing it with theirs.
Is that party one that we're going to be addressing when we talk about like interrelations between other leftist formations? Like, would you say that organization is on the left, but just an authoritarian strain that is kind of wanting to just grab the government basically and implement it, and by renaming stuff people's this and people's that, it suddenly becomes a dictatorship of the proletariat type thing?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Yes.
Struggle with a lot now with abolition, because there's been a lot of anti-police sentiments in the past couple of years because of the pandemic and how it's been militarized in the Philippines. And so one of the things that we usually see a lot online is sentiments about abolishing the police but replacing it with people's police or people's defense or something similar, or community police. But then for abolition, it's always been the question of why does it have to be a police? Why does it have to replicate these kinds of dynamics? And not just that, but even in the current relations that are present in leftist spaces that are sort of predominating in our spaces now, it's really clear, that their dynamics, the way that they relate with one another, the way that they treat a lot of different movements and different organizations that don't really align with their ideologies, are still very much replicating the dynamics of policing that we in Abolition personally want to abolish in all levels and all structures.
I don't know if anyone else had commentary on that, because that I think says a lot, and that seems like a pretty common struggle that we see here, is that there are organizations that are like, yeah, all cops are bastards except for the ones that we're going to hire and put into doing the job.
Yeah, actually, it's one of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to, in our engagement with the leftists, we try to tell them how carcerality manifests in the left, and how socialism is actually anti-carceral, because socialism is about the abolition of classes, but the police and prisons are actually things that reinforce classes. So obviously, police and prisons can't be instruments for a classless society. So, but it is very hard. There's a lot of resistance to the idea. So, but we've been trying to explain to them.
I mean, there's some pretty clear questions that I think people pretty naturally have. Socialized into whatever system that you're socialized into, you see harm exist in the society around you and between people in your community. And if the answer that's given to how do we resolve issues of harm, how do we keep ourselves safe and our neighbors safe and our family safe and what have you, it's a pretty easy answer these days to just say, if you haven't done some thinking, that, well, here's the solution is for this arbitrary third party to come in and be a sort of giver of justice and balance the scales between the issues, or resolve the issue by removing someone who's been causing harm from the situation. So I'd imagine there's a lot of a lack of imagination on the part of those folks. Do they react pretty well when you offer a picture of how the carceral system and how policing operate within their society? Or do people sort of point to existing socialism in other countries and say that's a model that actually resolved this issue? Their prisons and their police work well?
Well, yeah, so that's one of the things that we have to come up with, I guess, or confront when we talk about these things. They do cite a lot of experiments, I guess, with socialism and communism. But at the same time, when you try to point at how these things failed or eventually will fail, or whatever issues are already existing now, they'll be saying like, oh, but this country isn't actually socialist, or this country isn't actually communist. So they sort of flip-flop in different ways. It's very much a lot of dynamics of cherry picking, I guess, with what arguments work for them depending on what context. And one of the reasons, I guess, for that, and the difficulty with really bringing these conversations to bigger spaces and engaging with them in a deeper and more meaningful way, is because there's really a struggle, I guess, and an issue with the lack of political imagination that exists in the Philippines. So a lot of the concepts and ideas we have about participating politically, getting involved, talking to people, is very much skewed towards just showing political will. It's really a numbers game in a way, as well as just hammering people in with a lot of jargon that comes from leftist spaces, and not really much attention to how we ourselves prefigure politics and the future that we want in our current practices. So, and my personal experience as well now, in the different threads and sectors of the left here, you will see that they will be talking about socialist futures, better economies, destroying and abolishing the patriarchy, but in their personal relationships, the dynamics are so up that they actually cause more harm than they do good in their immediate spaces. So there's a lot of predators and abusers and harassers that are loose, and they get excused in these spaces because they'll say, oh, these people are really good organizers, they're really good political organizers and speakers, and so we can't just kick them out. And so that forces a lot of survivors of abuse and harm to just lie low, go underground, or maybe totally drop off the space together. And so when we talk about abolition, I guess, and the future that we want to work on together, not just in abolition, but even in the dinner party and maybe even Paglaya and Project Kapwa, it's really not just about that distant future, but really trying to bring these ideas into our direct personal relationships in our immediate spaces. Because otherwise, they wouldn't mean anything if they're not things that we can actually act on right now in the present moment. It's just that these are building blocks for us. But for the mainstream left here, I guess, or for a lot of the leftist spaces, they would think that we're talking about something that's too idealistic. If it's not too idealistic, it's too soft, it's too fluffy, it's not something that's really political because you're just talking about relationships and the personal. But for us, it's like, why can't these be arenas and spaces and battles in which we actually try to bring in, no, and live these ideas that we already have and we already talk about a lot.
Yeah, Castle, do you want to talk about the projects that you're involved in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, as well, you were talking about accountability and how community organizers and organizing work in our spaces. So basically, Paglaya is from English translation, I guess. It means to liberate or liberation, is was founded from a group of people deciding and realizing that we should go beyond common structures and hierarchies within our organizing spaces. So we are a group of people who were advocates, and we are still advocates of students' rights and welfare. We were focusing on having strong legislations or even or laws that would protect and uphold our students' rights and welfare as students in the university setting. So we realized that we should organize beyond legislations and reforms. It was even further than even more. We were empowered even more when our group was like we were just discussing what Magsalin wrote. Actually, it was a paper discussing towards an liberatory politics and anarchism in the archipelago of Philippines. So we were ostracized in the mainstream organization movement in both our university and on the national level of organizing because as anarchists in the norm of organizing right now in the context of the Philippines, we are seen as the irrational number in organizing spaces. So most of the time we are often said that we should drop out of colleges, we should drop out of our universities because it's basically it's how anarchists should do. But Paglaya is a university-based anarchist organization that explores, imbibes, and prefigures anarchist practices. So and it also hopes and organizes for and with autonomy, consent, direct actions, and free association. So within our spaces, we desire for collective total liberation and the cultivation of libertarian tendencies. And yeah, I feel like that's how Paglaya is and how we are identified as members of Paglaya. It was just a network of people like realizing that we should go beyond the in the Philippines, when you say progressive, that's the right way to do. Like if you are a progressive individual, the politics that you're in and the practices that you live by are the best thing that you can do to contribute and to live as an individual. So we realize that as individuals, especially in the university setup, we should go beyond progressiveness and we should go beyond the established structure of organizing because we were ostracized by the seniors, by people who are part of the higher levels, by fourth year college students, from well-known organizers in our spaces because we were exploring and it was dangerous because we do not have leaders to guide us in these organizing moments of our lives. So that's Paglaya, I guess. And Project Kapwa, if we're going to talk about Project Kapwa, it's one of us Paglaya members practicing and experimenting how mutual aid goes. Fun fact about it, actually, in the university setup, we have this one specific professor who like they did not attend in one of our classes, and like so we just decided that we should reach out and explore, I mean, as organizers, as proactive individuals in our university, we should like try and like encourage them to like we should do our own activity and project. So that's Project Kapwa. So Project Kapwa basically is our channel and our medium of practicing and prefiguring a society wherein mutual aid is like really not just mainstream, but like really, we live by mutual aid in terms of like really not just exercising but really espousing the society that we want when we are in crisis, when we are struggling with different, especially in the Philippines, since it's an archipelago, we are really in different natural disasters and everything. So Project Capwa and Paglaya basically are new bodies of like exploring and experimenting with of anarchism and prefiguration. So I feel like they can share as well if how they see Paglaya and Project Kapwa. So yeah.
You mentioned Paglaya being limited within the realm of people relating as students and people like wanting to drop out or get out. I don't know how long or how institutionalized, how long that project has been going or how long Paglaya has been going. But if there's room for it to sort of like bridge to the outside, because having a space for libertarian-minded students seems important, even if the people that are in the group maybe are kind of not wanting to be in the school space anymore. I don't know if there's like room for a bridge to organizations or groupings outside of the student realm.
Actually, right now, because we were like really attacked by both the administration and the student organization that accredit movements and organization within university, within our university. So we decided to structure it in a way that's acceptable inside the university. But right now, as our organization and as our network is really growing and we are learning anarchism and prefiguration, we are currently deciding on and talking about how we can destructure it and to like disorganize the network to like really go beyond the norm of organization, that when you are a student you should focus on student movement, you should focus on what you call the student organizing, because that's how we were conditioned in the mainstream organizing of the left in the Philippines, that you should be part of the masses and be aligned with a specific strand of politics. So right now we are actively discussing and learning how we can destructure and disorganize Paglaya so that it can go on a more local setup and at the same time on an individual level, not just like really organizing for like being part of this membership, but like as people who we were talking with in Abolition, TDP, and other anarchist spaces, like rather than membership, we should build and work together within our societies and communities. So that's how we see Paglaya right now in terms of the question that you said.
And there was a question in the chat of the meaning of the term of Project Capua in English. I don't know if you want to translate that if you can.
It's one of those probably not directly translatable Tagalog words, but I guess the closest word that is mentioned in the chat is fellow. So it's like kapwa refers to an other, but it's this other that isn't necessarily a stranger, but someone you still actively care about and treat as part of your community. So it's something like that.
Okay.
I can add on that as well. Like actually, Project Capua was like envisioned to like really have. I mean, it's our project wherein we want to espouse and like really imbibe the mutual aid aspect, the key tenet of anarchism of having mutual aids and everything. So Capua for us, it's like really someone who is your equal with potential and equal with the knowledge that you have, because in our spaces right now in the context of the Philippines, you're not considered as a kapwa and like part of the movement if you are not organized and if you are not part of the membership. So you're not considered as a fellow activist if you're not part of, even if you're like ranting on Twitter, if you're like demanding accountability in different platforms of social media and different platforms on ground and online, you're not part of our spaces if you do not know these, especially on a political and theoretical level, if you're not knowledgeable about such stuff. So Project Kappa really wants to acknowledge that issue and at the same time really practice that even if you do not know these things on an academic level, you're still part and you are still capable and able enough to be part of this community and organizing mutual aids.
Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of jargon that activists can sometimes bring up. And as somebody mentioned in the notes, gatekeeping. That's a really good approach, I think, is recognizing that a lot of the directions that at least like the anarchisms that I've interacted throughout my life, sometimes it's based on a lot of study, but a lot of the practices are based on things that people normally do in community with each other and like a mutual respect, as opposed to having a degree or being able to quote some dead bald guy. Or bearded guy. So I really, I think that's a pretty cool approach. Was anyone wanting to speak about Cavite Mutual Aid? I don't know if anyone on here was. I didn't hear.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I am part of Cavite Mutual Aid. I invited someone from our group to actually speak, but they were unable to attend because I don't want to be, taking that space because I'll be speaking for abolition. But yeah, so basically Cavite Mutual Aid started before abolition. It's a mix of people. They're not necessarily anarchists, but there's a couple of people from the anarcho-punk community. So basically what we do is mutual aid stuff. It's somehow like related to food net bombs in Cavite. So it's basically like not the same, but most people from that group as well. So, right, so Cavite Mutual Aid, since there is like already established community for food not bombs in Cavite, so it's very easy for us to, like do food pantries or food distribution projects. But also, since I'm in the US, I'm able to like do fundraisings and like, send some money over there to help with our projects. Other things that we do with Cavite Mutual Aid is that we do support medical needs of people in our community. We're basically the group who do the fundraising for them, kind of like distribute that money to them. But also we do a bit of survivor support. It's just like there's a lot of things that we do based on how people within the group is capable of, kind of like the same with abolition. So yeah, but we basically call it a mutual aid group because that's basically like the main thing that we do in Cavite Mutual Aid.
So, I mean, the Philippines being an archipelago and being, the series of islands that are very, I'm sure there's like a ton of distinction, cultural distinction with the fauna and the flora across the archipelago, across all these islands. And I'm sure that power is dispersed differently, whether someone's in like, one of the major cities or in the countryside. Are you all like kind of based in the same location? Are there like certain cities that you have in common?
So you basically live in what's called the National Capital Region. It's kind of like a national core, which is kind of like an imperial core, but for a country. So this national core actually has a name, which is Imperial Manila, where Filipinos can see Manila as a sort of imperial capital where the peripheries always have to follow the rule of a very distant president very far away. And so this notion of core periphery relations is something really deeply felt by Filipinos, and yeah, we live in the core.
I do want to mention though that we do have members, people associated in our collective that do live outside of the National Capital Region, but I think majority of us do live in NCR or have had a lot of experience within the National Capital Region.
That doesn't mean by any means that the experience is monolithic, I would say, because I live in a part of the National Capital Region, or Metro Manila, as we call it. That's a bit newer. It's like a young city, I would say. And so a lot of the experiences I have in the periphery of the imperial core, I would say, is a mix of urban realities with a more rural, I guess, pace. So even within the Metro Manila, because of the local governments, because of municipal governments or barangays, I guess, even experiences within the core are very different. Different levels of poverty, different levels of, I guess, government responsibility and action or inaction. So sort of in Metro Manila, we have a joke about some cities being called the Soviet East because the cities in the East have a better functioning and more responsive government compared to the rest of Metro Manila. But even then, we still live in the core, and it's sort of like just a difference between how competent people in government are, not necessarily like how much better they are at their job.
Sometimes less competency is a better thing.
I think Castle and me is from the South. Me, specifically, I am from Cavite. I don't know how to describe that place, but people used to refer to it as Florida of the Philippines.
That means a lot of things to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
Hey listeners, we are considering some changes to our fundraising scheme on Patreon, as we're not quite making enough month to month to cover paying the comrades for the transcription work. We've changed settings on our Patreon site, patreon.com/TFSR, so you can see what our monthly take-in is. It costs about $115 per episode to transcribe, which is a pretty fair rate, as I understand. And each month there are 4 to 5 of those, so you can do the math. If you value our transcription work and that the fact that these interviews are getting to be more accessible and translatable, you can learn more about how to support us with one-time or recurring donations at tfsr.wtf/support. If you have ideas about what would entice you to join up to our Patreon, send us some feedback via email or by DMing us on social media, or you can send us letters. There's a bunch of ways to get a hold of us. We're not that hard. Thanks a lot.
We take the timeline, we stay alive. We take the timeline, I'm losing my mind. We take the timeline, we stay alive. We take the timeline, I'm losing my mind. We take the timeline, we stay alive. We take the timeline, I'm losing my mind. We take the timeline.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
Well, cool. I wonder if you would share a little bit about your understanding of the introduction of the theory of anarchism into the Philippines. Obviously, there's a lot of really important discussion about whether the theory is the important thing or it is a way that like Western philosophers were able to point to commonalities among communities and urges towards equality or tendencies towards equality and commonality in those communities. So the like circle A or capital A or whatever maybe isn't the important thing. But I wonder about like as an organized movement or project, if you could talk a little bit about anarchism in the Philippines and how it's been suppressed in the past by communist parties, the church, the state in different ways at different times. And how did you all get involved in that tendency or in autonomous anti-capitalism, if that's more your jam?
Anarchist tendency really only emerged within the past 30 years in the Philippines. Very long time ago during the American colonial period, like the first decade of the 20th century, there were anarchist literature floating around in the country, brought home by the first Filipino socialist, Isabel de las Reyes, but this never really cohered into a coherent tendency. It never became an anarchist tendency. They were just anarchist inflected. And sooner or later, they were, because of the success of the Soviet Union, the revolution in Russia, they were absorbed into the old Communist Party, the PKP 1930. And then fast forward decades later, at the eve of the Marcos dictatorship, there's this one historian who suggests that the Samahan Demokratik Kabataan Mendiola, or the Association of Democratic Youths Mendiola, which is the place, was an anarchist organization, and that they commandeered a fire truck and crammed it into the presidential palace, which is pretty cool. And but it's kind of difficult to tell if they were actually anarchists. I haven't been able to find surviving literature from the period, so it's still up in the air. But if they were, Paglaya is like a sort of the first anarchist student organization in 50 years, which is something. But they eventually were absorbed into the Communist Party of the Philippines, the new one, the CPP, and they disappeared. And then, so that brings us to the 90s, where punk rock brought new kind of anarchism to the Philippines, and that developed into a punk anarchist milieu that moved around food not bombs, and later on we've emerged like within the last decade, I suppose. So that's us. We're the latest wave, and we represent something hopefully new, not just new to the left, but also new to the anarchist scene here, because the anarchist scene here is what you call manarchist. Manarchist meaning it's man plus anarchist. It's very patriarchal, very insular, very navel-gazing. So we're hoping to introduce some kind of new articulation that really reaches out to more people and just a very niche circle. So that's what we've been doing. As for suppression, it's very clear that the government suppresses the National Democratic Movement, which is a tendency that emerged from the new Communist Party of the Philippines. But they're not all actually affiliated with the Communist Party. The Communist Party is the one who developed the tendency. Anyway, this tendency is the one that's most heavily suppressed by the government. And not only that, but the tendency themselves, the Communist Party, also suppresses other leftists. So 20 years ago, they started an assassination campaign against Marxist-Leninists and Social Democrats. And just last year, they bombed the labor leader with the group Centro. And that was bad. They apologized, but they're never. But when they apologize, they're never transparent about why these things happen. So we don't actually know why he was killed. So this is the same Communist Party that 30 years ago murdered hundreds of their own cadre. So these people, you can't really trust these guys.
Yeah, so I think it's very important as well to mention that for me personally, I think that a lot of people got into anarchism because of the anarcho-punk scene, because that's like my entry point, like listening to music and then reading scenes such as Profit Existence, Thug and Leto, Slingshot, Maximum Rock and Roll. So more of my politicalization is into zine readings and like exchanging zines with like people from abroad. From my experience as well, a lot of people from anarcho-punk spaces has been organizing long before, like Food Not Bombs, mutual aid initiatives, free market. So yeah, most likely into that. And then because there is a very rich zine culture before in the Philippines, like I think that's like where most of like anarchists in the Philippines entry point is, like hardcore punk scene as well.
I guess just to add a bit to what Magsalin was talking about a while ago. So for a bit of context, I worked for someone who used to be intimately involved with the CPP, so my boss used to be involved there. And I guess one of the things that I learned from there was really how much of the leftist politics of what we would call the peak of the mainstream left here is really also super personalistic. Like it can get really petty. Like there are issues about money that have literally led to people being kicked out of the party and then not being able to come back to the country because they're blacklisted and they couldn't access any direct route back to the Philippines, etc. And I think one of the conditions that they were talking about wanting to do for this was really like acknowledging the purges that happened and trying to help the families of the comrades who died back on their feet, sort of like giving financial assistance to them. And so the leadership of the CPP rejected that. They didn't want to get involved in it. And so there's still sort of like a stalemate. So you get a sense of how petty and not even ideological at all these struggles and battles within the left are. But at the same time, it's not just on the leadership level because of the structure and because of, I guess, that kind of dynamic that's going on in the party, it cascades and gets replicated even in the personal lives and interactions of a lot of the members of the mass organizations. And so for me, my context is I came from a very different background, I guess. I came into anarchism by way of feminism. And so I really only got roped into it because my professor, who was also starting his journey into anarchism, sort of just pulled me in and said, okay, read all of this stuff that I'm reading. And so for me, it felt like a natural, a natural progression into that direction, because for me, a lot of the things that I believe in and identify as a feminist for are things that are common in anarchism. A lot of it is about really equalizing a lot of the vertical and hierarchical power dynamics and relationships, and really talking about how it's not just about liberating people from the patriarchy and from gender oppression and suppression and gender struggle, but also about a lot of how the intersections of class and gender and ethno-linguistic background or race, religion, etc., are things that we have to collectively address and address together, and not just sort of reduce into the issue of class. So the left in the Philippines, in my experience, I got radicalized in the university. I wanted to join the left, but then I found a lot of people who said that they had really negative experiences. Not to discourage me, but just to give me a context of what I wanted to get into, I guess. So in my experience, a lot of it is really, a lot of these people would talk about how harmful the dynamics have been. And the organizations really focused a lot on class. It's very class reductionist here, the left. They would brand anything that doesn't relate to class as identity politics and sort of say it with disgust. They would say that as if it's a bad thing, as if identity wasn't an integral part of your humanity, you know. And so for me, it was a constant and ongoing question of what is it really that we are experiencing, and why does it have to be reduced to class when we know that a lot of the things that we struggle against aren't really things that will go away when capitalism goes away. And just for a bit of background, I'm a sociology graduate, so those are the questions that I guess kept me up at night and helped me not get into a lot of mass organizing and mass organizations or groups, really, because I felt like they weren't really sufficient in addressing a lot of the fundamental inequalities that we struggle with, especially in the Philippines.
I'd like to point out that our milieu isn't just an anarchist milieu, it's also an anarchist and abolitionist milieu. Because we do have people who don't identify as anarchists, but do identify as abolitionists. And I think that's important because after all, the Invisible Committee said it's not up to the anarchists to speak militant, it's up for the anarchists to be polyglot. Was that right? I don't think it's right.
It is not up to the rebel to speak anarchist, it is up to the anarchist to become polyglot.
There we go. Yeah. I really like that.
Like what I've mentioned before, like my politicalization or like my entry point with anarchism is from the anarcho-punk scene. This is like one of the issues as well that we have within our anarchist abolitionist milieu, is like, because we do have this kind of like a joke wherein, you know, since people's politicalization are different, like there is this like division between anarchists in the Philippines where like there are people who are anarcho-punks, right, whose their entry point is more on the music scene. And then there's people who's more like into the academe. And so from my experience being involved in the anarcho-punk community, like there is this fear of people from this space from engaging with people from the academe, from anarchists in the academe, because of like a lot of barriers, like with language, like people from the anarcho-punk scene doesn't like discussing theories a lot, but I think it's important as well. And, you know, it's crucial to like challenge ourselves when we're replicating harmful systems or harmful behaviors. I mean, so like one of the challenges and one of the questions that we have within our group is that how we are going to be more engaging with like people whose entry point to anarchism or like whose politicalization with anarchism is different from us. Like say, for example, Cavite Mutualite, like what I mentioned before, like a lot of people from that group is from the anarcho-punk scene, and we would like to be able to engage them more with projects from abolition, though we're already doing that, you know, like we're already, you know, supporting each other with like our projects and initiatives, but we want more of like an engagement, of like more of like talking discussions on how we're going to apply our politics in our personal lives, like how are we gonna organize better that's different from the normal organizing dynamics that there is from the leftist spaces. And I think if Adrienne would like to discuss more about what the dinner party would like to do with this challenge.
Yeah, as mentioned a while ago, not only the existing left spaces, but even anarchist spaces here don't really focus on how immediate actually and everyday a lot of the political ideas that we talk about can be. And so in the dinner party, we tend to focus a lot on this everyday aspect, especially particularly on relational politics and building relationships with each other, because we think that the harm and oppression, I guess, that exists not only on a state level but on a very general structural level gets replicated a lot in our personal relationships, because that's how socialization works. That's how these structures work. To sustain themselves, to maintain themselves, to perpetuate and survive, they have to really embed and inculcate themselves in the everyday lives of these individual people, of us. And so even we ourselves, as people who identify as radicals, are also implicated and required to do the personal work of actually asking, what does a better future look like? What does an anarchist utopia look like for us? And so the things that we've mentioned and seen in our spaces is that the politics that they talk about, that they preach about, isn't really something that they live. But for the dinner party, we find that it's urgent and it's actually more concrete and doable when we start talking about the practicality of our politics existing in our personal relationships. Because when we talk about politics as something that we have to confront in our everyday lives, it means that it's not just that the personal is political, it's also that the political is personal. And therefore, it's something that we have to really actively and consciously live in and live through. And one of the most immediate and certain ways to do that is in our personal relationships, in our friendships, in our families, in our romantic relationships, sort of like the idea that the revolution starts at home. It's not just some motto or like some sappy thing that radicals say. It's an actual truth, because unless we look at how we replicate inequalities and violence and harm in our personal relationships and change it, we're not going to be any kind of good radical. We're not going to be kind of any good activist. We're just saying, we're just hypocrites, basically, because we don't actually live and act on the politics that we talk about and talk about and keep on preaching to other people about. And so for me, it's not just an abolition of the state. It's not just a revolution in the streets. It's actually a revolution that involves every single aspect of our humanity, of our personal life. So for me, it's that kind of thing that if you don't struggle with the change, if you don't struggle with your politics, if it's not difficult for you, maybe you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I really resonate a lot with what Adrienne said. Just to give context, I'm actually one of those people who don't identify as an anarchist, but I'm still part of Abolition, and I still also engage with the dinner party. And I really appreciate spaces like these because I don't feel forced to have to identify as an anarchist. Although I do feel like I have anarchist leanings, I do feel like I resonate with anarchist values. But like being in this space, I don't feel like I'm forced to, be an anarchist in order to engage with them. Like it's a very welcoming space, and I feel like I learn so much from them. I don't know, because personally, like I've never had any experience in mainstream organizing spaces, especially mainstream political organizing spaces. And even though I did graduate from the university, like I don't think any form of like politicization and radicalization came from that. I think for me it came from being exposed to Twitter, honestly, for me. So initially, like I wanted to say that my view of mainstream organizing came from Twitter, particularly Philippine leftist Twitter. And I did always get the feeling and notion that in order to be deemed as a legitimate organizer, you had to join these, specific rallies, or you had to be part of a mass organization. And this was something that wasn't really possible for me because I have multiple health conditions. I can't even work a regular corporate job because I get sick very often. So imagine like joining a mass organization where like there's a lot of work involved. I thought it was out of the question for me. So luckily, I was able to find this space. And then when I realized how organizing works in this space, at first I was a bit shocked because it really wasn't the same kind of organizing that I saw on Twitter. But I really appreciate that because to me, like organizing was like work. And when I first got into Abolition, I did volunteer for a project, but I was unable to follow through with it because I got sick and because I was dealing with a lot of personal things. However, it wasn't taken against me at all. Like what I like, for example, about organizing in Abolition is that they really take into account what happens to each person personally. So there's no forcing, meaning that you can engage with whatever level you're comfortable with. If you have to take a break, it's really not a problem at all. And this was really so different from what I saw, from the feeling I got from mainstream political organizing spaces there. That's it for now. Yeah.
Yeah, just adding into what Kay and Adrienne said. So one of the things that the leftist spaces, organizers in general uses against anarchists or anarchism to devalue our efforts is to say that, like to measure our productivity when it comes to organizing. That's like a thing that we're very critical in abolition. Like we don't want to replicate that thing kind of dynamics. Like I've been part of like the national democratic movement for quite some time, but I'm already like into anarchism during that time. I think I'm just like looking for a space where I can organize, because there isn't that much organizing spaces that's focused on like anarchism or that's organized by anarchists. And so I've experienced where the dynamics in the leftist space is that they're measuring your productivity when it comes to organizing the same way that capitalism measures you. And I kind of have like this joke wherein at least in under capitalism I can take days off, I can file for PTO, and that's something that you cannot do in the leftist organizing spaces, because they're gonna gaslight you like this is someone else's experience. But I've heard where someone was told that the revolution will continue even without you, and that's like not a good thing to say to someone who might want to take some time to take care of themselves. Like not only self-care, it's supposed to be collective care. You're supposed to be caring for that person as part of your collective. And so like I've mentioned, this is one thing that we're very critical in abolition. Like we don't want to be replicating that kind of dynamics. And so what we do in abolition is that there will be a time that we're really going to be full of energy when it comes to doing projects and organizing. Like everyone is hyped, like the chat is nonstop, like even at night, like seems like people are not sleeping and just like putting in their ideas. But then there will be a time that people will be dealing with their personal struggles, like with their personal issues or whatnot, and like we aren't going to ask much from that person, like say, hey, why are you not doing this, why are you not doing that, why did you stop organizing? We're kind of more like what we can do to support you, to make it easier for you, not necessarily because we want you to go back into organizing with us, but because we want to support you in your struggles. That's kind of like us embodying or like living by example that this is what anarchists do. This is mutual aid. This is systems of care that we want to nurture, we want to create in our communities. Yeah, and so that's like a very good dynamic that I'm really proud of in abolition, and that like with the other spaces that we're creating, that we have established, like the dinner party, that's like the same dynamics that we have there, with like Castle's project as well. That's like the kind of dynamics that they have adopted. And so I think because of that small effort, as other leftist organizers see our efforts, we have created systems of care, not only in our spaces, but in a larger space that we aspire to engage with our organizing, or, like other communities that it's not really part of our circle, but we want to engage with.
Yeah, I just want to add on all of your frustrations to the mainstream left in the Philippines, especially on a personal level. I mean, I've organized with and worked with national organizations, so it's really damaging and harmful realizing how they organize, and it's really helpful and really healing realizing that there are spaces like the dinner party in Abolition. So, I mean, they do not pressure you really. So the dinner party, when they organize you, I mean, we're having a reading thing right now on joyful militancy. So like they don't pressure you on like reading on chapters 1 and 2 before like moving forward. But in the mainstream left, you have to go through this process of learning, but not like really engaging, and you're not allowed to engage with the conversation if you're not yet finished with chapters 1 and 2. So that's like the general theme of how organizing right now with the left. I mean, on the Philippines. So you have to go through series of training, series of like really educational discussions with joyful militancy, with the dinner party. It's really an open discussion of like, regardless of the level of learning and knowledge that you have, it's open and it's like really joyful, and at the same time really accepting to the availability that you have, physically, mentally, and everything, in all aspect. It acknowledges you're human. It acknowledges your being of what you call this, being involved with other activities, not just in this kind of discussion and such. So yeah.
I think without saying, we kind of like leaving by that article from Nadia from Crime Thing, where it says, where the title is like, your politics are boring as like like, like, we would like to make sure that the way that we're engaging with each other is the same way that we're gonna engage with people who's not involved in, like, let's say, any organizing or radical spaces. Like, how are we going to talk to them is the same way that, we're gonna talk to each other, like how we're gonna treat each other as well. Yeah, and it's like, witnessing how our group is growing. And like what we have said, we're not necessarily everyone is anarchist. There's abolitionists and there's other people as well who's also still in the national democratic movement, or who have left the side space or movement engaging with us. That's like a very big win for us, that other leftist organizing spaces might see us, like, something small, like doesn't really matter. But yeah, for us, it's a very big win, very important.
Yeah, I was like thinking of like discussing how the culture of harm and violence inside radical spaces we have, and the lack of accountability within these spaces. So I don't know, I feel like we should discuss it on right now. Like, I feel like in the dinner party in Abolition, like, I really learned a lot with them, along with them, like how these things really impact our lives. I'm just new to this whole thing, so I feel like in radical spaces that we have right now in the Philippines, there's really a lack of accountability, especially if you are running with a party right now in the Philippines. The accountability is shrugged off. Your elbow. I mean, we have here a slang in the Philippines. You're elbowed when you demand accountability, because they have leadership and they have experience within these spaces and organizing spaces, even if they're like considered as radical. They're considered as leaders basically. So I feel like these are the tendencies that we should like really look into and really explore unlearning, because the harm and the violence towards survivors in organizing spaces is not really acknowledged enough. So yeah, I just want to like, think out loud.
It feels like when I've been in organizations or in milieus where there are these informal hierarchies, like kind of like I mentioned before, or where there's an ongoing abusive style of relationship or communication or whatever. If a thing continues on for a while, it becomes more and more difficult to address it in a sort of comrade to comrade manner. And so I wonder if that's a thing that you all have talked about, is sort of an informal, like, I know this is like a Maoist term, but like self-crit. How do you work on creating community spaces where there's room for people to take each other aside just informally and say, hey, like, check in, how you doing? Like, you kind of blew up at me during the meeting and discussion. Is there anything you need? Room for feedback in that way. And does that sort of undermine the building up of like abusive formal or informal hierarchies?
So I think this is why it's particularly important that our political core and political base in our political work really starts in relationships with the dinner party and our general milieu. Just because when we talk about situations where harm comes in, or where someone gets hurt, or when there's something that we really need to talk about, those personal relationships tend to be what eases and helps facilitate those conversations of confronting and holding each other accountable. And so, for example, when we have an issue where someone made someone else feel uncomfortable, it's really about talking with each other, bringing up that maybe am I crazy, or did this sentence or did this interaction come across as like this to you as well? And then when you get that validation, just because a lot of us have also experienced a lot of manipulation and abuse and trauma in our life, so we really need to have that sort of a survivor support interaction going on as well. When we establish that sort of thing, that okay, this is what happened and this is what you felt in that interaction, we get to really talk with each other and bring these issues up without feeling like we're being attacked. Because when we talk about this thing or that thing, we're talking and we're coming from a place of love and care from this person. It's not difficult because we just don't have a strictly professional relationship with each other. We just don't treat each other as, sort of like comrades in the way the left typically uses it. We're friends. And because we're friends, we care about each other and we want each other to be better. And we want to reduce the harm that we sort of mete out on each other. And so it's really a mutual work of trying to deliver politics in better ways with each other, in such a way that we can hold each other accountable and therefore bake politics into our personal relationships and make our personal relationships that space of prefiguring these politics that we really want to do and show the people that we can do without really having to resort to hierarchical structures and organizations.
Just to add to what Adrienne was saying, right? Because we kind of like want to like have this relationship with each other within our organizing spaces. It's kind of like more easier for us to kind of like call in each other, like address if we're having issues, because I do have experience like being in the older anarchist milieu, and we kind of like trying to stay away from that group, and like that's why we call ourselves like the newer anarchist milieu. And like I see the dynamics, the difference in both groups, right? And like with the older ones, like they're not really into accountability or like transformative justice or how do you resolve conflicts within your group. It's more of like replicating the same systems that we have right now that's existing. And so like the question is, how are you going to address conflicts or issues within your group even if the state is gone, if you're replicating the same systems, right? And this is something that we want to do differently within abolition, within the dinner party. And it's kind of like funny because I think a couple of days ago we have what we call a kamustahan session with our reading group, which is we're reading The Joyful Militancy. Kamustahan is more of like the check-in session that we have with each other, where we kind of like just talk about anything that's too personal for other people to talk about or a thing to talk about in organizing spaces. You know, what I've seen from this is that a lot of like cis men within the group are comfortable enough to share about their experiences and admit that, hey, with this experience of mine, I up. I was sexist, I was misogynistic, and I'd like to do better. Like, how can we do better? What else can we do? And so like from the previous Kamustahan session that we had, we came up with this idea of how about we create like a work group or a space specifically for cis men within the group to kind of like talk about how they can do better when it comes to being accountable, calling in each other instead of relying to women or non-men within our groups to call them in and like do so much emotional labor for them to understand what their issues are and like how they can call in or like address this kind of issues outside our space, and like, you know, like with people who's not really politically involved at all, like how are they going to do it? And like what I've said, like most of our discussions, like we will have like say like so much political discussion, but we will also we love, I think Ian and me and other non-men in the group like pointing out about domestic labor, about emotional labor that women and non-cis men does within the group, and how we would like to distribute that labor because that is necessary and that should be like everyone's work. Like say for example, at this time it's mostly like women and non-men doing survivor support, and how we kind of like want to distribute that labor and want everyone to engage. And so we're trying to create like maybe we can have a discussion, like we can have a workshop so people will know what to do, and then from that we can extend that outside our spaces.
I guess just to add to that as well, going beyond our spaces, I really noted that what's resonant with people who are political here but hate the current state of politics and the left or don't want to get involved with the mass organizations is really this whole message and focus on the relational and personal aspects of politics. Like that's somehow one thing that I consistently notice from a lot of people. They would resonate with a lot of anarchist or abolitionist ideas, but it's particularly because of how personal and focused on improving personal relationships these ideas are that they sort of tend towards that direction. So I think there's really this existing critique, although maybe something that people can't verbalize as well yet, that there's something really wrong with the political state of the Philippines, whether be it because of the state or because of the state of the left. And so when you talk to people or when you hear about their complaints and how they struggle with participating politically, it's really that focus on the one hand, we know that the state is shit, it fucking sucks, but at the same time, the left isn't doing any better. And so what space is there for us? And so we're trying to nurture and sort of incubate this space and help people find a way to express themselves and be able to create their own versions of our comfortable and safe spaces, so that it's not just us, you know, it doesn't become like a sort of centralized dynamic again, but it's something that people can do with their own friendship groups or with their own affinity groups or with their own spaces, and therefore sort of decentralize this idea that politics has to be a strict and formal organization.
So the Philippines has obviously had a very long history of colonization and neo-colonial dictatorships that suppress popular movements and social welfare for the sake of extractivism. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that trend has been coming out from under the Duterte presidency, including during the early days of COVID, and what you see coming out of a new Marcos era, since, the son of the dictator was just elected again. And I wonder how, not only if you could talk a little bit about these dynamics nationally, but also about how you see your communities and how you see other interesting parts of what might be considered like leftist movements engaging around the concept of decolonization, whether it be in support of ecological struggles against extractivism or around challenging or troubling historical hegemonies or language cosmology or like centralizing certain ethnicities in the archipelago. It's kind of a big question. You're welcome.
But I think one of the things that Magsalin and I talked about earlier when we were discussing this question is that there's really a particular historical context that the Philippines is also coming from, because the archipelago, even before colonization, has really been deeply embedded in trading networks, especially because it's an archipelago, it's in the middle of the ocean, and so there's really no monolithic identity for it from the get-go. But at the same time, because it's so accessible and has been so embedded in trade networks, that the question of indigeneity, I think, is just not something that we can apply as easily as, I guess, more landlocked discourse and dialogue might assume, or might how these dialogues might work. So, for example, in my particular context, I am technically Filipino Chinese. I have Chinese blood, but I'm so divorced from the Chinese side of my family that I don't really know what goes on there anymore. And I identify really more with the post-colonial, or I guess more neo-colonial context of the Philippines and the identity aspects of it. And so this isn't just my reality. This is the reality of a lot of people who identify as Filipinos, because you can't really distill the identity of a lot of us into who's indigenous and who's not. Because from the very beginning, even before we were colonized, there have been intermarriages that have mixed and mingled with different cultures and different backgrounds and different heritages. And so there have been intermarriages, for example, in the Tausug ethno-linguistic group and Chinese traders, because they were really a hotspot for Chinese trading, even before Spain got to anywhere in the Philippines. And so just talking about the colonization and equating it to indigeneity is such a difficult thing for us to, or for me personally, I guess, to process and to understand, because it's like the whole question is who gets to be indigenous and who doesn't. How do we trace this heritage when a lot of us are really mixed blood, no? A lot of us are either children of people who came from colonizers, or just people who came from trade intermarriages and stuff like that. And so I think with the conversation on decolonization, there's a particular context we're coming from and that we want to center, and that it cannot be reduced or simplified into a sort of ground zero situation where we go back to the very roots, where we go back to talking about pre-colonial histories and identities, because that's just not a reality for many of us. So many people will be displaced. So many people will be forced into situations and relationships of harm because it's not a discourse and a reality that applies. And so for me, when we talk about decolonization, it's really more about talking about confronting, okay, we've been colonized 3 times for over 300 years, and because we've been colonized in that way, and our identity is basically not something you can cut off, I guess, or untangle from all of this history, from all of these cultural, transcultural, and intercultural influences and backgrounds. It means that when we decolonize, we actually have to face and confront head on these realities, because if by decolonization we mean going back to the pre-colonial, we mean going back to the indigenous, that's just a simplification of wanting to go back to a non-existent time and point in our history where our personal and political histories were not linked to one another. So I just think Magsalin can expand on this a bit better, you know. But I just think that the colonial discourse in the Philippines or in our archipelago is not going to be the same as the colonial discourse that exists in other parts of the world.
Is there discourse around decolonization going on in terms of people's communities' relationships with the rest of the world culturally, or like we're all speaking English? That was sort of like brought up kind of jokingly in the beginning. I find it very useful because my Spanish is poor, and that's the only language other than English that I can speak any of. So I value the fact that y'all are willing to speak in English. But yeah, I kind of just wanted to touch on that general framework. Sorry to be long-winded.
Oh, we don't actually speak Spanish because, funnily enough, the Spanish never taught Spanish to us during the Spanish colonization period. Although they did the last few years of the colony, but by then it was still too late. So like people around Latin America talk to us. Why don't you speak Spanish? They keep saying this every time we meet Latin American people. We're not really indigenous, but we are what Benedict Anderson would call Creole. We're Creoles because we're not exactly those. We don't exactly exist in the settler colony because we were forcibly separated from our land, or from our traditions. Therefore, we're as colonized. We're Creoles, Creole or Creolenized. So as Creoles, of course, there are still indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So when in contact with indigenous peoples, Creoles become settler colonists. This is true in the sense of Turtle Island ideas of decolonization. So land back is quite applicable here. So decolonization in this regard is the Creole respect of indigenous lands, the cessation of colonial logic on indigenous people on their lands, recognizing indigenous stewardship, all of this. But outside of these settler colonial zones, what is exactly Creole decolonization? So, historically speaking, Creole decolonization was the transfer of sovereignty from a colonial overlord to Creole state. In the Philippines, this was the United States giving the Philippines formally its independence. But we don't really recognize that the new Creole state continues, because the new Creole state continues to reproduce many colonial institutions and features, centralized state apparatus, the police, the prisons. Before colonization, there was no state. And its appendages did not exist. The police did not exist. The prison didn't exist. So Creole decolonization is really the replacement of one colonizer head with a Creole head. So all the institutions of colonization still in place. This project of decolonization is woefully complete as long as the state apparatus, the settler colonialism, the Creoles, and other colonizing patterns continues to exist. The archipelago, so-called as the Philippines, not decolonized by virtue of having Filipinos in charge of the state, especially if we see colonization as an explicit process of state building. In this sense, decolonization for Creoles, that's us, of Metro Manila, is the undoing of the state, the undoing of wage labor, the undoing of the police and prisons. So colonization imposed these things upon us. So decolonization should mean the doing away of these things. This doesn't mean, however, that decolonization is to return to an Eden before decolonization. This is impossible because we can never go back. Rather, decolonization is the recognition of these institutions instituted by colonization aren't permanent features, aren't inevitable features of society, and thus there could be a future without these institutions, without the state, without the police, without prisons, without wage labor, without capitalism, all these things that colonizes and was brought over here to colonization and continues to this day. So this thing isn't really well understood by the left. National Democrats believe in Stalin's theory of national democracy. National democracy is the idea where there should be a bourgeois revolution before a socialist revolution. So in this idea, it still reproduces wage labor because you still have capital, you still have the building of productive forces using capitalism, using wage labor, and you still have the state, you still have police, you still have prisons, and we probably might even have gulags because after all, the Communist Party did kill all those people. What really the vision of the left doesn't really take decolonization into its own terms, in terms of actually undoing what colonization did to us.
I guess this time I want to respond more to the context that Bruce was talking about with this question on decolonization. So currently, the state has been taking up this project of devolving its powers in a way. So they've been talking about federalism for like a few years now, quite a long time actually. And as we mentioned earlier, there are barangays in the Philippines. So barangays, basically they're like smaller communities. I guess they're kind of like villages or towns in a way, but a more local version of this. And so there are local governments, barangays, etc., that really sort of govern, no, and have authority within their very small localities. And so what's been going on with the state is the state has been trying to devolve its powers to the barangays, to the city governments, to local governments, so that things don't get stuck in the central anymore, so that the national doesn't have to rule on every single thing that happens in the local. However, I would like to raise this idea that the federalism project that the state is trying to accomplish and the devolution of powers that's going on is sort of something parallel to what anarchist ideas and abolitionist ideas, I guess, would talk about, which means sort of putting the power in the hands of the people who really know their context better, the people who actually live in that situation. However, there's still this presence of authority, basically, of leaders who are making decisions for people without really understanding what's going on in their personal lives, what they actually need. Not to mention the fact that politics in the Philippines really focuses a lot on not only personality politics, but really like a sort of padrino culture, which is basically getting close and cozy with people in power, and then whoever is friends with that person, they get positions, they get more resources, etc. And so there's already sort of like an approximation or attempt at really giving power back to the people. But it still doesn't do away with this whole idea that there has to be a figurehead. There has to be someone who's running and calling the shots and stuff like that. I think with the project of decolonization, while there's one focus or there's one reality or there's one attempt at least in the local about really giving the power back to the people, it still does not trust the people to be able and capable of doing politics themselves. It still thinks of things as sort of patriarchal, in that sense that there has to be a father, there has to be a leader, there has to be this figure who's running things, because people they tend to get infantilized. They're still treated like they don't really know what politics means, what managing resources actually looks like. And so to me, the decolonization project in the Philippines in that aspect doesn't really have to jump through a lot of hoops in that sense, because even with the presence of governments, even with the presence of barangays, people are already living life outside of the grasp of the state. They're already trying to make ends meet on their own. They're already trying to settle their own conflicts on their own. They're already trying to get people out of trouble on their own. And so the presence of that devolution of powers existing parallel to people already existing in sort of the cracks of empire, is what we say, or what we refer to it in the dinner party. There's already such huge opportunities for people to be able to govern their lives and to really self-determine on their own. It's really just a matter also of getting people to believe in their own capacity and their own tendency. And for me, that the colonization project is really sort of bringing the power and giving it, not just giving it to the people, but also making the people realize that they have had this power all along. So I hope that somehow addresses that more concrete and current framing of the question on decolonization.
So, just to put everything into context, back in December last year, Duterte has signed into law an amendment that allows 100% ownership of common carrier industries like mining, railways, and other big projects, as opposed to the 40% capacity that was instituted back in 1987. And during the election campaign, one of the big business oriented platforms that Bongbong Marcos had is to allow quote unquote sustainable mining to operate in the country. So, as far as foreign intervention and extractivism in the Philippines, we can only see that expand in the future.
Yeah, that was a helpful contextualization.
What I wanted to bring up was in connection with what Adrienne mentioned, and also kind of kind of relating to what we brought up in the beginning about the genealogy of abolitionism in the Philippines. Because earlier Adrienne mentioned about people already trying to solve conflicts on their own outside of the state. And I just wanted to uplift the fact that, like, in terms of abolition, like, it's not just about us as people who identify as abolitionists. Even without the jargon of abolition, transformative justice, a lot of Filipinos already engage with ideas of abolition and transformative justice, in their own ways. Like, since, for example, the war on drugs has affected poor Filipino families very disproportionately, a lot of people don't choose not to engage with the police because they feel like it's going to be more harmful for them. Indigenous peoples, IPs, they fight against, militarization and the like. So I just wanted to uplift that, even if there are people who don't identify as abolitionists, there are people who are already practicing ideas related to abolition, related to transformative justice.
Hi. So I'm just gonna try to build up from what has been established here, from this entire discussion. One of the main problems that we've had with the left and others, that despite their like unwavering optimism and these things, there's still like this insistence of like taking politics seriously and taking it like romantically, I guess. I don't know. I've seen this in liberals, like despite their like pretenses of like hope and positivity, that there's still like this latent undercurrent of like, this is like the most important election of our lives, we have to like do this, or we have to like fight or for some weird reason. And it's awfully like draining, at least speaking personally, so the fact that people take themselves seriously, there's this an insistence, at least towards the people in themselves, to burn out, because they people think that these things matter too much, or I guess there's a lot of pretenses towards like this higher ideal, just because these things are supposedly in abstract bigger than themselves. But this is one of the things that the dinner party wants to address, that in the first place, like, it's not necessarily that we don't want to have any pretenses towards something bigger than ourselves, because in one sense it's a drain for people within this particular movement, and it's also like it's a tired sort of trope within our own society. So in one way, we, at least for my sake, I hope that for the dinner party to have like some sort of, not a focus towards politics in the sense of like identities, campaigns, or like ideologies, or at least like the theatrics of it, but more so like focusing instead on like the personal aspects of it, in which like we want to like befriend people, I guess. We just want to have fun in general. We want politics to be less about like the issues in the abstract, but more about making it more like everyday life, I guess.
Basically, the dictatorship of the Duterte, and now the threat, the Marcos dictatorship, is really, before Marcos was even pronounced as the president, we were really scared, because we know our history, we know our roots with the Marcos era. So it was really how active we are in organizing in the university was before the elections. But we are often attacked under the Duterte dictatorship because of how proactive we are in such spaces. And I'm just gonna share right now how Project Kapwa started from an initiative inside the university with Paglaya. We started from an initiative where we ideated from practicing mutual aid for animals inside the university, and from there we were like somehow ostracized because we were like beyond our jurisdiction, and at the same time beyond orders of the university. So we realized that what's the point of like having spaces like these, but we're not able to organize. From there, they also said that, why are you focusing on animals? And I mean, like, it's the beginning of the pandemic. Why are you like doing actions for animals? So we were like checking on the people, how they would be receptive of mutual actions and mutual aid actions inside the university, within the university. So from there, Project Kapwa came to be. So yeah, so right now we're focusing on local community action, building conversations within the community. That's how I feel like it's very threatening right now, because we're like going against the structure of how authoritarian the current administration is within the dictatorship right now, and the implications of the prior administration of Duterte. So yeah, I feel like that's the thing that I can share right now. If you can support Project Kappa through PayPal, I feel like it would be really helpful, especially to organizers and within the community that we are in right now. It's at Terraynera. It's TERREYNERA. So I hope you can support Project Kappa. So that's it on my end.
I'd like to add as well. I think what Castle, correct me if I'm wrong, is trying to say as well is the tendency with other leftist organizing spaces is that, like what Adrienne said, they tend to be class reductionists. Like they tend to force people, especially in organizing spaces, to feel like there's only one important issue that should be addressed. Say, for example, like issue of Marcos being voted as the president, instead of seeing our struggles to be interlinked or to be intersectional with each other, which is, I think, the reason why they've been telling Castle that, or questioning Castle as to why your group is doing support for animals instead of like people struggling. So just looking into what's the more important issue to be addressed, instead of changing that mindset and thinking that all our struggles again are interconnected to each other, and there are ways to address our struggles together, instead of just like focusing on one issue.
Okay, so jumping off from what Honey said, this concept that our struggles are interlinked really is an important idea in Armalu. The idea that we not only have to, we call it our struggles interlinked. This idea that not only that our struggles are already interconnected, especially how, for example, Cambridge Analytica not only got Trump into power, but also got Duterte and Marcos into power. So we see how these types of struggles, United States and the Philippines, are connected through Cambridge Analytica. But these sides of struggles are connected in the sense that the empire connects them, but those people in those side struggles don't necessarily connect their sides of struggle to one another. So that's why we say we should actively interlink our struggles together. So another example in terms of intersectionality, and not in terms of physical side of struggle, men are oppressed by the patriarchy. And their liberation is ultimately tied up with the liberation of women, the liberation of queer people, the liberation of trans people. And so our challenge then is, again, to go back to invisible committee. It's not up to the rebel to speak anarchist, it's up to the anarchist to be polyglot. It's up to us to speak all these languages, struggle to one another, and link them together in some sort of coherent whole. And this is also what we've been trying to do in Abolition. This is a last example. What do people who use drugs, sex workers, and incarcerated people have in common? Well, not much in the sources. But through the framework for abolition, these types of struggles can be connected to one another to actually resist policing in a way that combines all these types of struggles together.
I just would like to emphasize with everything that has been said by Castle and Magsalin about what we are really doing and aspiring to do in our spaces in Abolition, in a dinner party, Cavite Mutual Aid, like the projects that Castle is involved with. Because again, the tendency with leftist organizing spaces is that they always separate what is political with what's personal. And so they do not see that a lot of our personal issues has something to do with how we fight the system, with how we fight the state, with how we fight systems of oppression. And without addressing those personal issues, then we're unable to really address these larger issues that we have. Because you've mentioned earlier, like the leftist groups to have this concept of self-crit, right? And I think that's their attempt for accountability and transformative justice. But then, like what Adrienne mentioned before, like with our experiences with the leftist spaces here in the Philippines, they tend to focus more about not holding the person accountable because they're very good organizers, instead of saying that that person can be a very good organizer, but there is still an opportunity to hold them accountable, and that's something that is possible to do. That's something that we can work on instead of just shutting down survivors, shutting down people that has been harmed, because most of the people that got engaged with our spaces do have this similar experience where someone from their collective or their group has been harmful, and they try to address that issue within their collective, and the collective has been dismissive about it and they don't want to address it. And that's something that I would like to emphasize that is very important with Abolition, the dinner party, and other spaces that we're engaged with. We're really big into accountability and transformative justice, because we believe that without those, then we're just basically being hypocrites, with our politics.
If one doesn't have an alternative to carcerality, or the idea that someone can be thrown away to make the rest of society better, that we have to work through these problems without just either sending in a third party with guns to deal with it. We're definitely losing a thing. And that topic of how do we address harmful activity, how do we point to someone's activity being harmful and that person not necessarily being a bad person, but having bad patterns that if they want other people to work with them, they should work through, and that maybe somebody has space to work with them and it's not the responsibility of the person most directly harmed to do that work. Those are like topics that I've heard coming up over the last 30 years that I've been involved in activism. And I haven't heard I just don't think that there's one answer that fits all, that fits that solution, a solution for everyone. But I think that is like super important to work through. I don't know if that's kind of what you're talking about too.
Yes, definitely agree with that.
Well, yeah, thank you all for having this conversation, for staying up so late where you're at. I really appreciate it. And I do want to leave it open. If there are any subjects that you're really burning, that you're like, we didn't get to this and I really want to talk about it, then I totally have space and energy for it. I understand if folks want to wrap up, assuming that there isn't something that someone wants to jump in with. I'd like to hear about where people who are outside can find the projects that you're in. Castle was kind enough to leave with like a PayPal link for Paglaya. But if you have either writings that you think are important that have been produced inside of your milieus, or ways that people on the outside can support or start to engage, either from the diaspora.
We've really been also been trying to expand abolitionism to other countries in Southeast Asia. So that's pretty cool. So if you're from Southeast Asia, try to connect with us.
Got a website or an email address?
I think one of the things that I want to bring attention to really is the feminist struggle in leftist spaces, and even especially anarchist spaces. It's really been one of the biggest problems we've been confronting. The abuse and the harassment, the misogyny and transmisogyny, the homophobia, it's just really, really bad. And so for me, one of the things that I really want to do is to link up with different, whether anarcho-feminists or just people who identify as feminists, wanting to link up and talk about our common struggle in political spaces, as still being really violently affected by the patriarchy and the left. I would love to talk to more people and find out how we might be able to move about through this together. So yeah, they can tweet us at our username on Twitter is Dinner Party PH. It's just Dinner Party PH. So they could DM us on Twitter, or shoot us a message. We can talk about these things.
Kambaka is currently underground, but if they do resurface again, you should definitely reach out to them and interview them. They do really good work in Malaysia. In Indonesia, Anti-Feminist Feminist Club really does interesting work with anarcho-feminism.
Well, thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. I've really enjoyed meeting you, and again, thanks a lot for having a talk at this hour in English with me. I've learned a lot, and I hope that we can keep in touch.
Thank you so much for your time and for giving us this space. It's really a lot, and I'm really glad to be able to share this space with you and with every one of my friends.
Thank you so much for the opportunity for this space, for sharing it with us. We really appreciate it. We were so excited and still excited up to now, I think, because like the possible connections are like network of people we can connect with after the interview is published.
And now here's Kevin Rashid Johnson, Minister of Defense for the Revolutionary Intercommunal Black Panther Party, on his medical condition in a Virginia prison. Apologies for the audio quality. He is in prison. And thank you to the comrades who passed this our way.
Go ahead, comrade.
All right, this is a follow-up to my previous audio recording about my recently diagnosed condition of prostate cancer. Basically, I've been told that there have been a lot of people doing call-ins and email protests on my behalf, and I want to extend my great appreciation to all friends, supporters, comrades, everyone who's been involved in that effort. Of course, nothing can be achieved without the support of the masses, and the masses are our only source of defense. So I always look to the people for support and help whenever situations arise outside of my ability to control that affect, the work that I do and, my immediate well-being. But as it stands, my medical condition has not changed. Recently, I was seen in the medical department for continuing to pass blood in my urine, presumably as a result of the biopsy that I received over 2 weeks ago. Medical staff did tell me that it was not an ordinary condition, that the bleeding should have stopped within a week. I was given a urine test where they did an in-house dip that determined that there was, in fact, blood in my urine, and they said they were sending a specimen out to a laboratory to be tested, and that it was possible and appeared to be white blood cells in my urine, which would indicate the body's immune response to an infection, which they were saying it was possibly an infection with as a result of the biopsy that was taken. By and large, my condition has not worsened that I can speak of. It's not improved either that I know of. But I was told when I spoke to the doctor here on July the 1st, when he gave me the diagnosis of prostate cancer, that I would be seen within 2 weeks at the hospital again for follow-up and to determine my course of treatment. That visit has not happened. It's now over 2 weeks later, today being July the 17th. And people on the outside with whom I have contact who are in fact also fighting cancer have expressed to me that this is a situation that needs immediate treatment, that there's no way to determine at what point the cancer can spread, whether it has spread or not. And once it starts to spread into my lymph nodes, it's essentially going to be a lethal condition, irreversibly lethal, and that they need to get care in response to it immediately. So outside of that, things have not changed. And again, I appreciate everybody's support and assistance. And that's the extent of what I would add now as a follow-up to my prior audio recording about my present health condition.
This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.